from there. So in the part of our last session on the DynamoDB, we are going to learn how do we actually calculate the read capacity units and the write capacity units. Of course, we have a capacity calculator as we saw yesterday, but it's good to know how we can calculate manually how many read capacity units or write capacity units would be required. So I'll first quickly go ahead and log in into my AWS account. So I'll quickly open up my slides to just check through the formula part. There you go. I'm able to log into my AWS account. We are in the North Virginia region, and let's quickly navigate to our DynamoDB service. There you go. When we are actually trying to go ahead and create a table, we do get a capacity calculator. So let's open that as well, and we'll also learn the practical way of solving how many read capacity and write capacity units are required. So here is my capacity calculator, and let me open up the slide. Okay, here we go. So as we all know, the way in which DynamoDB is going to be priced for us is two ways. One is based upon the number of read capacity and the write capacity units, and second is on the basis of the amount of storage that I'm going to make through. So storage is a clear concept, like the amount of GBs of data I'm going to put across, I'll be charged across that. But how do we calculate how many read capacity and write capacity units would be actually required for my real-time case, right? So here are the two units, that is read provision throughput and the write provision throughput, or you can call it as a read capacity unit or write capacity unit. Now whenever we are talking about the read, so all reads are basically rounded up to the increments of 4 KB. So these are the thumb rules that we need to follow for the calculations. So all the reads are usually rounded up to increments of 4 KB. So even if I'm trying to read the 1 KB of data, it is considered to be 4 KB itself, because any read will be considered to the nearest number of 4 KB. Now, there, as we saw, there are two different types, whether eventual consistent or a strong consistent reads. So if we talk about the eventual consistent reads, it can do up to 2 reads per second, while the strong consistent read does only 1 read per second. That's why here we have written in third point that strongly consistent read consists of 1 read. Now, when we talk about the writes provision throughput, so all writes are 1 KB itself, and the all write consists of 1 write per second. So within 1 second, I'll be able to write only Yeah, within 1 second I'll be able to write only one write, which is of size 1 KB. And in case of read, within 1 second I'll be able to read around 4 KB of data, but depends again whether it is eventually consistent or strongly consistent. So let's go ahead and quickly make a calculation here. So this is the very first example that we're going to look forward for. So you have got application that requires you to read 10 items of 1 KB per second using the eventual consistency. What should you set the read throughput to? So I'm going to design an application in which my system would be requiring something like 1 KB of data per second should be read, and there will be 10 items for every second. So how much read throughput should be picked up here? So as I said, even if you read 1 KB, it doesn't matter. It is going to round it off to the nearest 4 KB. So first thing is I'll round it off to the nearest 4 KB chunk, that becomes 4. So the formula is simple. This is the magic formula. So the size of read rounded to the nearest 4 KB chunk divided by 4 into number of items is equal to the read throughput. And later we'll decide whether it is a eventually consistent or strongly consistent in this case. So let's go ahead and calculate. As I said, 1 KB will get rounded up to the nearest 4 KB. It becomes 4. And the 4 KB divided by 4 will be again 1. So one read unit would be required in this case. However, I am going to read like this 10 items. So it is going to become 1 into 10 as 10. And since we are using eventual consistency, we are going to divide by 2. That makes it 5. So total 5 units of read throughput would be required. Now let's do the same calculation using the DynamoDB here. So I'll go down to the capacity calculator I have opened up here. So I have said that I'm going to read 10 items of 1 KB per second. So the item size is 1 KB. Reads are going to be 10. So you see here, and if it's eventually consistent, the read capacity becomes automatically 5. So the same is the answer that we have received here, that is 5. Now let's try to go ahead and solve the one more example. Here I am going to read 10 items and the size is going to be 6 KB per second. So as I said, we have to round it up to the nearest 4 KB increment. So 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, right? So the nearest one to the 6 will be 8. Now 8 KB divided by 4 is going to give me 2, and the number of items is 10 here. So 2 into 10 is going to give me 20 items overall. So, and since it's eventual consistency, I'm going to divide it by 2, so it gives me 10 read capacity units. Now let's try to do this again. So I have 10 items here. Now the size has become 6 KB. There we see the read capacity units has actually changed to 10. Let's move to example number 3. Here again I have got one application which is going to read 5 items, and each is going to be around 10 KB per second. Okay, so 10 KB, when we round it up to the nearest 4 KB chunk or a 4 KB increment, it becomes 12. Divided by 4 is going to give me 3, and the 3 into number of items here is basically 5, so it becomes 15. So the eventual consistency that we are going to get here is, since it's eventual, I have to divide by 2, it becomes 7.5. But can we assign 7.5? No. Just round it up to the highest number towards it, 8 units. So we can check this one as well. So I'll just say it is going to be 10 KB, and the number of items is going to be 5, and it is eventually consistent. Now you see it becomes 8. So read capacity has actually become 8 here in this case. Now if it is going to be the same example, and if I say strongly consistent, all I have to do is just remove this division of 2 part, and then whatever answer we get here, 15 is number of the units that I would require. Let's make it here. There you see it becomes 15. Right? So the example 4 is all about that. So we are trying to talk about the strongly consistent reads. So I don't have to divide it by 2 at last. Now let's calculate the write throughput. So write throughput is very simple. Now we have application that requires 5 items. which is of size 10 KB, and that is going to be read every second. So what should be the write throughput set to? Now, if you remember from the very first slide that we just discussed, read provision throughput itself has this lot of calculations, but when we talk about the write, it's very simple. I can write up to 1 KB of data, and I can do only one write per second with the help of write capacity unit. So in this case, now if it is of 10 KB of size, so I can do anyway only 1 KB, and there are 5 items, and it can do only one item. So simple is 10 into 5, that is 50 write units. So I just need to multiply the two different numbers, which is going to give me the size per second and the number of items that I want to write. So my write throughput becomes 50 units in this case. Similarly, the next example, I want to write 12 items of 100 KB per item each second. Now 100 KB into 12 is directly going to give me 1200 units. Now let's go ahead and calculate the same example here. So I'll say that I have 12 items to be written, and the size is basically 100 KB per second. So here you see write capacity is going to change to 1200. Right. So this is how we are going to basically make a calculation on the read capacity units and the write capacity units. Any questions here from any one of you? Divya, Rahul, Shiva? Okay. There's one last part in this slide here. So that is about 400 status HTTP status code. That is about provisioned throughput exceeded exception. Now what happens in this? Now let's say you have provisioned 5 read capacity units or 5 write capacity units for a specific table. Okay, but you are unable to make use of it, or it has actually throttled that. So if you're trying to exceed the number of read capacity and write capacity units, then you're going to get this error. So your database will not be able to write the data to that table because it doesn't have the sufficient read capacity and the write capacity units. So what happens in that case? So you're going to get this error, which is with the 400, and the full form of the 400 error in this DynamoDB is provisioned throughput exceeded exception, which means you provisioned a specific throughput, but it has exceeded the limits of the same. Right? So you exceeded your maximum allowed provision throughput for a table or one or more secondary indexes. So it could be with global secondary indexes, or it could be with the table as well. Now we all know that LSIs make use of the index. LSIs makes use of the capacity units which are actually assigned to the table itself, right? So it can be due to a global secondary index, or it can be directly due to the table. So in the table we have two components, the data that we are going to write to table as well as the local secondary index. Both are going to consume the capacity units here. So quickly moving ahead. The next part of the topic that we are going to discuss is about the Redshift. So with this, we complete the couple of things on the database section, that is about the RDS as well as the DynamoDB. Of course, in the RDS, there is one more thing that we are going to look forward for, that is about the Aurora DB and its specialties. So for now, we move ahead to the next part, that is about Redshift. So Redshift is completely a theoretical based topic where we are going to discuss what is a Redshift, what can we do with a Redshift, and why is Redshift so special, or on what basis the pricing is going to be done on the Redshift. So Amazon Redshift is basically a fast, powerful, fully managed petabyte scaling data warehousing tool. Now, I'm sure like we have been working in the IT industry, so you might or may not, I'm not sure. So you should have heard about the data warehousing tools or the business intelligence tools we call them. So there are many in the market, like specifically if I talk about Jaspersoft, Microsoft SQL reporting services, IBM Cognos, Tableau, Informatica, and then we have Hyperion, Brio from the Oracle companies. So there are a lot of tools that each of these companies basically has in terms of the data warehousing tool. So similarly, Amazon has also created its own data warehousing tool, and that is actually called as Redshift. So yes, in the market today, there are jobs available only for Redshift as well, because the data warehousing tools are still very much popular in the market, and there are certainly jobs available only for a specific skill. So if you just know Informatica, or if you just know the data stage, if you just know the Cognos, or if you just know Tableau, there are immense number of jobs which are actually available. So even is the same case with the Redshift. So again, data warehousing tool is again a huge topic in itself. So we are just going to have an introduction on what is Redshift, how is it being configured in the AWS, like what are the different parameters or different ways, and what is the pricing of the Redshift. So Redshift is a fast, powerful, fully managed petabyte scaling data warehouse service in the cloud. Customers can just start with as small as $0.25 per hour with no commitments in the upfront cost, and scale to petabyte or more for $1,000 per terabyte per year, which is less than the tenth of the cost of the most data warehousing solutions. Yes, as a part of our real time, in case if I am going to purchase a subscription from either IBM Cognos or maybe a Tableau or any other third-party company, we have to pay the licenses for the complete 1 year or more than that for using the data warehousing tools. So I guess Redshift is also able to make a place among all these tools which are available in the market, where you can just go ahead and start your own data warehousing tool as and when it is required. So maybe you can just start with as small as $0.25 per hour, and then the good thing here in the cloud is you can close down whenever the tools are not required, right? Or so that is the best thing, and we can take a backup, and whenever I would like to relaunch it again, so if, from the backup I'll recreate a new Redshift clusters, and then I'll be able to play around with it. And if I'm going to use it completely for 1 year as well, so it is going to just be a costing of around $1,000 per terabyte per year, so which is actually very less when compared to what other data warehousing tools are currently providing to us. Now if you remember from the introduction to database section, where we learned about what is OLAP and OLTP. OLAP is more about online analytical processing, and OLTP is more about the online transaction processing. So when we talk about the transaction processing, it is related to a single transaction. So we can actually make use of the RDS to get an information about a very single transaction. But when we talk about the analytics, we can think about the data warehousing tool like Redshift. Here we get actually a lot of records on which we are going to do calculations. Like this was example where we took across for the digital radio product, where I have to calculate the net profit for the EMEA region and the Pacific region. So what would be the approach in order to calculate it? So first thing is I have to find out how many radios were actually sold in EMEA, how many radios were sold in Pacific. I have to also find out what is the selling price, what is the unit price, and calculate the profit for one single unit, and then I'll be able to multiply it with number of radios which are sold in EMEA or the Pacific, right? So with the help of which I'll be able to easily get the net profit for the EMEA and the Pacific region for a digital radio product. Now, the thing is, it actually involves a lot of calculations, right? So I need to first find out all the number of radios that are sold in EMEA, and specifically I have to find out if someone has returned it or someone's order is in process, should that be considered or not. So all those things needs to be cancelled or considered. So if someone has cancelled it, or maybe someone would have placed a return request, so we are not sure whether they're going to connect it to order or not. So maybe initially our requirements of analytics could be very small, but as and when the management is growing, so they might also want to require to look into this detailed analytics. So it is actually going to involve a lot of calculations on your database tables. So directly putting on database tables will be difficult, so we make use of this data warehousing tools, because they are going to use a different type of architecture in terms of the database as well as the infrastructure as well. Let's see what happens in the Redshift. So Redshift comes with the two different configurations. One is with a single node, or you can go with a multi-node. Now when we talk about the single node, each single node can be of maximum size 160 GB, and if you think your data is growing more than 160 GB, you can go for a multi-node architecture where you have a leader node and compute nodes. So each leader node will have multiple compute nodes, and in the compute nodes we make all the calculations. Now you can go up to 128 compute nodes overall. So now, as we just discussed, each node can go up to 160 GB of size. So you can just imagine, when you have more than 160 GB, you can start putting in more number of compute nodes overall by going into this multi-node architecture overall. Now let's understand why Redshift actually works faster. So what are the techniques that are used by the Redshift in order to get the work done faster way? Okay, so the first is columnar data storage. The way it stores the data itself is very different. Basically, it stores the data in the column format. Now, if you remember from one of the example that we were trying to look through in our notepad here, so if you look at this specific example, now this is a table in which I have got multiple columns, and each of these columns has got multiple rows, and like we are trying to store the data, right? So the first one is with the employee ID, and then the name, first name, last name, mobile number, pin code, city, and the country. Now if you see here, I have the number. Employee ID is the number format, first name is of text format, again last name is of text format, mobile number is of again number format. So the way we are trying to store the data in one single row is basically a combination of different variable types, right? So one of them could be a text format, one of them could be a date format, something could be boolean format, something could be of number format as well, right? So when we are trying to store the data, usually in a database, it is stored in the form of rows, because we are going to use it for a single transaction levels. So it is going to be in a row. Now when we talk about the Redshift, it is going to basically store the data in the column wise. So what happens in the column? Now here if you see employee ID, it has got number format, everything is number. So it becomes very easier for it to grab the complete column at one shot and store it together. So the next block or the sector where it is going to store the data is again going to be of same data type, right? So it becomes very easier. So Redshift is trying to actually employ the database storage in terms of column base. Now what happens in the column base? Why do we use column base here? Because in the Redshift, now if you have seen here the example, the way we do it, now I have to actually calculate the number of radios sold in EMEA, number of radios sold in Pacific. So if I have a table here, it's unnecessary that I go into each of these rows, right? I straight away I want to get an answer. Let's say this is a table for the EMEA region, and similarly I have a different table for the Pacific region. So all I have to do is just go and get the number of entries in the table, or when I write a query, I'm just going to check across one column how many are order accepted and how many are then as order rejected. So I'm going to check only for those two things itself. So it becomes much more sensible that I start showing the data in the column based format. So instead of storing the data as a series of rows, Amazon Redshift organizes the data by column. Unlike row based systems which are ideal for the transaction processing, column based systems are ideal for the data warehousing processing and analytics, where queries often involve aggregates performed over the large data sets. Since only the columns are actually involved in the queries are processed and the columnar data is stored sequentially on the storage media, right? So as I just said, so when I have to store the data sequentially in the storage media, I can straight away start in the column based format itself, because column based format actually requires only a few input outputs, and it actually improves the query performance in retrieving the data from it. Now there's some other technique called advanced compression technique. Now when we're trying to store the data in the column based format, I have got the data of all the same data type. So here it is number, again it is number, again this is number and the number, right? So it becomes easier to compress this specific thing rather than compressing a complete row. So if I'm trying to compress a row, it will be difficult because it has got all the different formats. Sometimes I can also have date of birth or a Boolean value, right? So it is basically a row is combination of date, numbers, text, Boolean, and other things, right? So now if since it is all of different data types, compression might become a little difficult, or even if it compresses, it doesn't compress up to a greater extent as expected. So when you're trying to store everything in the column based format, the compression techniques work much better. So the columnar data stores can be compressed much more than the row based data stores because of the similar data is stored sequentially on the disk. Now Amazon Redshift employs multiple compression techniques and can often achieve significant compression relative to the traditional relational data stores. In addition to the Amazon Redshift doesn't require indexes or materialized views. Like for the normal traditional database, we create the indexes, we create the views, we create the store procedures to improve the situations. Here you do not need to put across any of these things like indexes or materialized views. So it is also going to occupy very less space in terms of the traditional relational database system. And when you are trying to load the data into an empty table, Amazon Redshift automatically samples your data and selects the most appropriate compression scheme. I don't have to tell Amazon Redshift what it has to do. I just need to straight away put the data across the way it is in the RDS table, and it's automatically going to sample it on the column base, and then it's going to store and then compress it as per the regular techniques. One more important thing is when we just learned about the different types of the Redshift that I can have, that is single node or a multi-node architecture. So in the multi-node architecture, when we are going to make use of a Redshift, I get an option of this massive parallel processing, which actually helps to process the data much faster. So let's say you have got multiple nodes and a single leader node, and you are trying to process the data so that you get the results much faster. So actually you will be able to get it because the processing will happen parallelly across all the compute nodes. So Amazon Redshift automatically distributes the data and the query load across all the nodes. Amazon Redshift makes it easy to add nodes to your data warehouse and enables you to maintain fast query performance as your data warehouse is going to grow across. Now in terms of pricing, how are we going to pay for the Redshift? So for the Redshift, the number of compute node hours, right? So the number of hours I'm going to use a single node, or maybe the number of hours I'm going to use a compute node, I'm going to only pay for that. Remember, the leader node comes for free. There is no charges for the leader node. It's only the compute node that we pay the prices for. And currently the billing is like you are going to be billed 1 unit for using 1 hour of Redshift, or 1 hour of 1 node per hour, right? So 1 unit for using 1 node per hour, but the unit price can keep changing. So currently there is no standard unit price. standard price for the unit. So it can be $1, $5, $10. From time to time, they keep changing depending upon the price of the competitors that they have for their data warehousing tools. So if you want to see out the current price for the single unit, you can just go down to the S3 calculator and you will be able to get across here. So it's going to ask me about the usage. So if I'm going to make use of one node, which is of going to be size, let's say DC1 large. So it minimum starts with DC1 large, that is 160 GB. So if I'm going to make use of 160 GB, and that too I'm going to make it utilized for, let's say, number of hours per day, it is only for 1 hour, then it's going to give me the price here. There we go. It is around $7.75 for one single hour of usage, right? So the current pricing of the Redshift is at around $7.75. Yeah, so Redshift is mostly used when your management really wants to find out some queries. Let's say we are a company who is selling the shoes, or let's say we are a company who is selling the watches. So once we have a little or more data, so let's say we are going to launch a new company in 2018 in January. From January, we are going to start accumulating the data. So some orders get processed in our company. Let's say, as I said, we might be a shoe company or a watch company. Let's talk about a shoe company. So we are going to make the shoes and sell them across the various countries in the world. So I'm going to get the data for the January, February, March, April, May, June. That's fine. Now, what can we do with this data? So actually the data is set to be a gold, because now let's say in the January 2019, that is 1 year from complete the day you launched it, you want to find out what did you do in the last year and what is expected to be done in this year, right? So you get a fair chance of looking at your company, how is it performing. And you can also get analytics, how much we were able to sell in the January, how much do I need to prepare for when I'm going to sell it in the February. So if things are going with the same pace, it actually helps me to know how much manufacturing needs to be done, how much imports or exports are needed to be done in the by my company. So the management is really worried about all these analytics, and that can be done using the Redshift. So that's why they call these data warehousing tools, or the data science that we call about these days, are much more popular in terms of helping the companies to realize their business potential and then help them to go into the right direction. So if you think you are a website like Make My Trip, and you have a lot of options, you sell the tickets for buses, you sell the tickets for trains, you sell the tickets for flights and the hotels as well, right? So you may want to find out from which location, who are the users who are trying to actually do a lot of transactions, and maybe for them you want to send every weekly one offer so that they always stay connected with your app or a website and they do make the transactions, right? So those are the business techniques they deploy with the help of this data warehousing and the data science tools overall. Okay, so we just got the price for the single unit per node per hour, and then we are also going to be charged for the backup. So if I'm going to create any backup for my Redshift, I'm going to be charged for that backup, and then I'm also going to be charged for the data transfer if I'm trying to do within a VPC, not outside it. Okay, so if I'm trying to do some data transfer, so I'm going to be charged for that. Now, in terms of security, yes, Redshift employs security, so you do not have to worry about it. So whenever you're trying to send the data from the database towards the Redshift, all the data is actually encrypted using the SSL layers. And if you are trying to store the data at Redshift, you have got AES 256 encryption methods, which actually take care about this. And by default, Redshift is going to take care of the key management, so you don't have to worry about your key managements in for the AES-256 encryption. Everything will be taken care by Redshift. And if you want to manage your own keys, you can actually start creating using the HSM, that is hardware security modules, where you can create your own security keys, and then you will be start able to use it. However, you also have option of AWS KMS, where Amazon is going to create a key for you and help you with the audit logs on what happens with your key at each point of time. And currently Redshift is available only in one availability zone, so they have still not expanded it like the S3 or the EC2, where you can put your resources in multiple availability zones and then put across a load balancer or something as such. No, because Redshift is not heavily used. It is used by management, but there are a lot of different tools. As I said, data science is picking up the market these days, so there are a lot of tools that actually are available in the market and as a competition. So they're not worried much about the Redshift yet at this point of time. So it is currently available only at one AZ. However, you can create a backup and put it as a snapshot, and then you can restore using the snapshot in terms of the outage in the availability zones. So if you think that availability zone is not working, you may already create a backup or a snapshot, and that snapshot can be actually used for recreating the Redshift clusters. So that was all about the introduction of what we can do with the Redshift part here. So any questions or queries on the Redshift? How about you all? Any questions here? Okay, let me check it out. I'll just go down to services, Redshift. Okay, so when I click on launch cluster, it's going to ask me for the cluster identifier. So I can just give some name as, let's say, AWS Training 2017, and the name of the database as AWS Training 2017. And this is specifically going to work on the port number 5439. And then the username, I'll just keep it very simple for now, AWS Training 2017. So we'll use the same username and the password. Okay, then in the second part is the node configuration. So the node configuration is basically asking me to set the size of the Redshift database. So I'll go with the DC1 large here, which comes with 160 GB of data. So it actually consists of 7 EC2 units behind the scene, which gets 2 virtual cores of CPU per every EC2 here, right? So 2 cores of CPU per node. And memory is going to be a 15 GB per node, and the storage is going to be 160 GB. And input output performance is moderate at this point of time, and you can, yeah, we are going with a single node. So if you go with a multi-node, you have to select how many compute nodes you would require. Then this becomes a leader node, and rest of them becomes a compute node. So I'll just put a single node for a while, and just go to compute. Okay, so it is going to ask me in the additional configuration whether we are going to make the encryption here. So if you are going to make encryption, it does ask me which method you want to use it, whether you would like to use the HSM, that is hardware security models, in which you create your own keys, or whether you would like to create a keys from Amazon itself, which is the KMS. And then you can choose the VPC where you want to launch it. So we are going to select a default VPC. Subnet group you can put across if you have. So currently we have not created any subnet groups here. So I'll just put it as default. Publicly accessible, again say no. Enhanced VPC routing. So if you want to have enhanced VPC routing, so for now you can just keep it as simply no. And availability zone, do you have any preference of launching this specific Redshift in specific any of the availability zones? You can select it, or else you can leave it as blank and automatically it is going to be a part of one of the availability zone. And then it's going to ask me for the security group. It is more or less like more of a database itself. So I can go ahead and select one of the database security group. And CloudWatch alarm, if you want to create, like whenever the disk space is going to nearby, it's going to send you alarm saying that you need to increase the size of the disk. And IAM role if you want to attach, so that the Redshift can actually communicate with any of the other resources. So you can actually select the role here if you have, and then click on continue. And finally, it is going to give you a page to review it, and then you can straight away just click on the launch cluster, and it's going to get started by one of your clusters. So more or less, it is same like the way we launch the database. The options are almost the way it is, like the VPC and whether would I like to make it public or not, and would you like to go ahead with the encryptions, and which VPC it is going to be a part of, whether I want to launch in a specific availability zone, and what is the size of this Redshift cluster. No, we don't connect it from the EC2. What happens is, whenever we have the data in the databases like RDS or DynamoDB, specifically we use RDS. So from RDS, we actually send the data to the Redshift. Now, how do we send the data? We have something called as, let me show you here. Yeah. Okay, so we have something called as data pipeline. I'm not sure which service it is a part of at this point of time. For developers, we have all these for data. Yeah, so as a part of analytics, we have it here. There is a data pipeline. So using the data pipeline, we actually pick the data from the RDS, put it inside the Redshift. Now, in order to connect to the Redshift, we have the third-party BI tools. So here, yeah, so we have something like SQL Workbench or any other third-party tools that we would like to use across in order to connect to this, right? So there are a lot of tools which are available. So you just need to use the UI. Some UI needs to be required to connect it, because when I'm going to launch this, it is just going to give me some endpoint and the port number where it is going to operate, right? So I need to pick up that endpoint, port number, database name, user ID, and the password, and I just need to pass it to the SQL Workbench or any other third-party licensed tool which is available in the market, and then I can straight away get connected to this Redshift and start performing my analytical queries. So using the data pipeline first, I need to shift the data from the RDS to the Redshift. So the data pipeline is the one service which actually helps me to transform the data from there to here. Hope that helps. Yeah, because we do not store any data directly to the Redshift, because it is the transactions that are going to happen on your e-commerce website or on your companies, and then you come to know what are the transactions. So you store all the transactions only in the database, that is either RDS or a DynamoDB. From there we are going to specifically move it to Redshift, because I'll be able to do the analytics much faster on the Redshift. We can do the analytics part also from the data which is available in RDS, but it's going to take a lot of time because RDS may not help you to retrieve results at a faster rate. So in order to retrieve the results at a much faster rate, we shift the data to the Redshift, because Redshift has the capacity to sample your data accordingly as per the columns, and then it is going to help me to work with it much faster. Now I'm not sure if you have really worked in one of them, so I'll just give you a small example that Hyperion uses. Let me show you one good example that I had actually in Oracle Hyperion. Hyperion and Brio are one of the same tools. Yeah, so this is more appropriate example to help you understand. So what happens is, the moment I go ahead and actually create the data inside these data warehousing tools, right? So I can straight away drag and drop the tables, and I can straight away say what all data I want. So here I get in this specific table, these are all the columns, and then I can straight away pull the column, like I want an aggregate of this column, I want aggregate of this column, and I can actually put across the comparison tools here directly, like what should be the parameter on which the comparison should happen. Like let's say I want to find the country code, so I want to find out all the orders made in the India country, so I can just have a name of the country or the country code and then do it across. I can actually connect all the tables at one shot. I don't have to write any queries in union, in joins or something as such. I just need to pull, drag and drop these tables automatically. If there is any primary key foreign key relationship that exists, it is automatically going to show all these equal to marks, and then you can set across your conditions and then just go ahead and run this, and it is going to give you the answers. So that is how the data warehousing tool works. So it actually needs the data to be put in behind. So the next we are going to talk is about the Elastic Cache. So first we are going to have an introduction on Elastic Cache for a while, and then we'll look into how we can actually check out for the Elastic. Yeah, sorry, I was just getting one call. Okay. So currently we're going to have a little introduction on what is Elastic Cache, what can we do with it, and let's move further. So what is Elastic Cache? So as we had in the introduction part for databases, that Elastic Cache is basically a kind of web service that makes it easy to deploy, operate, and scale in-memory caching engines in the cloud. So if I want to improve the performance of my databases, specifically Elastic Cache is a best one. So it actually helps me to improve the complete performance of my web applications by allowing you to retrieve information from the fast managed in-memory caches. Now, if you remember, we just spoke about one of those examples from the Amazon website where the home page will have a lot of banners which are actually displaying the offer. Right? So I know that these banner pages are going to be clicked across at least for more than thousands or millions of times in a specific day. So instead of every time going and hitting the databases and then trying to retrieve the results from the database, which is going to consume my CPU cycles, actually I put it behind the Elastic Cache engines so that the data is retrieved much faster. Now, as here we see this Samsung exclusive sale is going to come up, so many people would be interested on to what to see what is this sale all about, right? So maybe if I click on the banner, it is going to show me the details about this page on when is it going to be launched, what kind of offers can I expect it here, right? So it is asking me that I can go ahead and notify, right? So maybe there's some new mobile that's going to get launched and that is something being shown up. So Amazon surely knows that this page is going to be accessed at least many a times in a day. So they have actually put it behind the Elastic Cache engine so that it can be cached across and then it is always served from those Elastic Cache engines. So Amazon Elastic Cache can be used to significantly improve the latency throughput for many read-based heavy applications such as social networking, gaming, media sharing, and Q&A portals. Specifically, we also see that there are a lot of videos that get uploaded to the YouTube or maybe to this Facebook and other ways, right? So they can also make use of these Elastic Cache engines where a specific video is, let's say, being used for more than 5 times, and I try to actually put it behind the Elastic Cache engines so that next time the sixth user who's going to watch the same video doesn't have to actually hit the database and get that completely video loaded, but in fact Elastic Cache engines can cache it, and then from there only I'll be able to go ahead and load it across. So caching improves application performance by storing the critical pieces of data in memory for the low latency cases. Cached information may include the results of input-output intensive database applications or queries, or the results of computationally intensive calculations. So it's not just that I can put only the static data, but if you have some computational data like calculations, something as such, you can also put them across. So there are two different types of Elastic Cache engines. One is Memcached and the second is Redis. Both of them are open source tools, and Memcached is a widely accepted tool at this point of time. So if you want to go with a very simple configuration, you can go with the Memcached that comes with a single node architecture. So Elastic Cache is protocol compliant with Memcached. So the popular tools that work that we use today can be easily merged with this Memcached environment. And in case of Redis, it is basically again open source tool which uses key value store, and that supports the data structures such as sorted sets and lists. So you get a little wider range in the Redis. So Elastic Cache also supports the master and slave replication and the multi-AZ, which can be used to achieve cross availability zone redundancy. Right. So with these Redis engines, you can also have something like master and slave replication configuration, and you can also have it between the multiple availability zones for cross availability zone redundancy. So usually if you are going to attempt for an exam, they are specifically going to ask you more about what is Redshift or more what is Elastic Cache. So just remember that Redshift is used when your management wants to let you know what is the specific result, right? So like if your database is feeling stressed because your management is trying to run a lot of OLAP transactions, then Redshift is a good answer. But if it is like only read heavy database and not prone to frequent changing, right? Like let's say in this case, as I know that this page is not going to change for at least next 10 days. Like it says for next 4 days, it's going to keep this banner, right? So I know that this is going to be a kind of like static data. So I'm going to make use of Elasticache in that case. So if due to the number of transactions that are hitting my database of read, it's going to keep the database busy, then Redshift is the answer. If it is just a read heavy and not prone to frequent changing, then Elasticache is a good answer. So you just need to overall know a basic concept on what is Elasticache, what is Redshift, how do we play around with it. However, I will just showcase up the configuration of Elasticache in the upcoming labs. So any questions or queries here on the Elasticache? How about Rahul? Any questions here on the Elasticache part? Okay, so there are two different types of Elasticache engines we have. One is Memcached and the second is Redis, and both of them are open source tools. So in case if you want to have very simple architecture, you can go with the Memcached. And if you think your website has got your web application or your normal application has got a lot of complex sets, like you have sorted sets, lists, arrays, and you want to go with master slave replication concept as such, then you go for Redis. So Memcached is used for very simple cases where you just want to implement Elasticache engines with any of the web applications directly, and Redis would be used where you have a little complex methodology. Okay, then so we'll close the session for the day here itself. So any more queries or questions before we close it? And how about the class tomorrow, or would we connect back only in the new year on the 2nd of Jan? Okay, then so we'll have a next session on the 2nd of Jan. So thanks all for your time. It was great time with you all guys here on the last year where we started a journey on the AWS. Hope you all make a good time with the cloud and the AWS in the next year. Hope to wish you see you back on 2nd of January in the morning at 7, and Happy New Year to all in advance. Thanks all. Bye and have a great day and great weekend.